So now we're at Sinai already. Okay? And the writer tells us that Israel at this stage had very few cultic traditions and an unseasoned faith. Remember, God had taken them out. They were still developing as a nation. They were still getting organized in terms of not only their religion, but as a people. But we will see how that happens in this particular chapter. Moses had been carrying most of the religious responsibilities in judiciary and religious matters. Okay? So he was both priest and judge at the same time. The religious rituals had to be developed and leaders and priests ordained. So that is all part of this new lesson. The tabernacle was needed to symbolize the presence of God, one of the distinctives of the nation of Israel. It was merely a symbol of the presence of God, while other nations were actually beginning to worship these objects. Here, this represented or simply symbolized something very unique and special to them. The presence of God dwelling in the midst of the congregation of Israel. So much development and organization takes place between the giving of the Ten Commandments at Sinai and the entering into the Promised Land. Lesson 10 discusses the construction of the tabernacle and the development of ceremonial laws. And then the book of Leviticus continues the interest in Israel's worship. The book is devoted to priestly laws, activities of the priests and the Levites. Many of the laws are found in other books of the Old Testament as well. Lesson 12 covers the narratives and the laws in the first part of the book of Numbers. And lesson 12 completes the narrative of Israel's history under the leadership of Moses. Deuteronomy, I know it says Pentateuch, however, the time is too short to deal with Deuteronomy also. So, studies in the Pentateuch, lesson 10, the tabernacle and ceremonial law, which runs from Exodus 25 to 40 and Leviticus. And the aim here is simply to become acquainted with Israel's institution of worship. That tabernacle is apparently a very beautiful, constructed piece of work. And we also read of the men and women who God chose. It says specifically they were full of the Spirit to present these beautiful offerings in terms of the curtains, the ark, the lampstand, and so forth. God reveals His plan to Moses in His tent, whereas the tabernacle represented the presence of God dwelling in the midst of the people. Remember, the tent is always out in the camp at the stage, and He meets with God. The tabernacle, however, was in the center of the camp and used in the complex sacrificial system. But we'll also see how the tent moves to the middle of the people as they journey. So there's always transition happening here. Moses received specific instructions regarding the layout of the tabernacle on the mountain. And remember, the word, if you go to the Old Testament, even the New Testament, you always read, the Lord asked him to do this, then it says, and he did that. The same here, he gets the instructions, so you read the later chapters, which tells you how they actually accomplished and did it. The reason for the tabernacle was for God to dwell in the midst of His people. The ark. Here was the most sacred and significant feature. The ark was the most sacred and significant feature of the portable sanctuary. God on the move. You know, we have mobing. So this one mobing, this mobing, always on the move. Here again, God is not static. Already here God proves to them, even though they must have the sanctuary, He is not confined to a time or for a space in this case, even though that has a significant value to them. The golden lid was decorated with 2 golden cherubim, and here His invisible presence was under the overarching wings of the cherubim, and the lid called the mercy seat. It was carried using poles of acacia wood through the golden rings on each side of the ark. And the laws of the covenant, and its tablets then, was also obviously inside the ark, symbolized Israel's responsibility to obey God, and Moses would approach God, who was enthroned on the mercy seat. And 2 things come to the fore there relating to God's mercy seat. One, the opportunity to come and confess and receive forgiveness, but also Moses entering in, speaking face to face with God and receiving revelation from Him to deal with the people. The blood was sprinkled on the mercy seat on the great day of atonement, which only obviously happened once a year when they entered in. They were only required literally once a year to come and say they're sorry. It was almost strange. But that was, even though that was a set out date, it was not necessarily always that individually they would do that. The vessels of gold, this is the table of showbread. The vessels of gold were for the purpose of wine libations, the pouring out, and they contained also the bread of the presence. Now it seems that some cultures believe that a god needed food. There is no indication that the bread of presence was intended for that purpose in Israel's symbolism. The same thing with the bread and the wine. Same thing, it's merely symbols. The bread possibly acknowledged the Lord as the sustainer of life. And Jesus clearly says, I am the bread of life. The lampstand, tabernacle, veil, altar, and court. Remember, there was an outer and an inner chamber, and then you had a court around it. So the lampstand holds 7 lamps, and it will lit each night and symbolize the Lord's giving of light and guidance to the people. The ark was placed in the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber of the tabernacle. So the tabernacle had 2 parts, an inner chamber, which was the Holy of Holies, and then you also had the holy place, which was on the outer part of the tabernacle. An embroidered veil separated the outer and inner chambers, and this stuff was actually about 4 meters high or so, maybe even 4.5 if they say 15 feet, because 6 foot 6 was already almost 2 meters. So you're looking at 4 to 4.5 meters high, these curtains. It was actually a huge, spectacular building once it was constructed. The candlestick was outside the veil on the south side, and the table of showbread on the north, both inside the outer chamber, which is also called the holy place of the tabernacle. And you have the altar and the court. The word altar simply means the place of sacrifice. And this is where the priest would come, and there would be this huge half of braai, which was either filled with earth or stones, and then it had this grate around it, which he actually stood on when he did the actual sacrificing. The horns, the projections at each corner was regarded as the most sacred place of the altar. This is where the blood of the sacrifice was applied. And to touch them meant sanctuary for any person. The tabernacle was surrounded by a court, actually a huge setting. Even those curtains that was set up, even if you think of the veil or the screen that they had outside to the entrance, it was huge, 35-foot screen. The priestly garments and other things connected with the tabernacle were considered holy because they were set apart for the service of God. Just like the people were set apart, so the clothing was also set apart. That the priests were responsible for the sanctuary. They were offerers of sacrifices, guardians of the Urim and Thummim, that had to do with the revelation of God, which they used. And the givers of oracles, they were also teachers, and they were also ministers to the people. So they were standing in and on behalf of the people. When Aaron wore his garment, now his garment was very specific and very different to his son's garments. Remember, he carried the 2 stones on his shoulders, and each stone also had each stone had 6 names of the tribes of Israel inscribed on it. When Aaron wore his garment, he represented Israel in the presence of God. The pouch or the breastplate of judgment on his garment represented Israel before God, and its contents were the means by which God's revelation was determined. The skirt of the robe was decorated with pomegranates and golden bells. Now those bells were very important, obviously, because he went in, and if those bells stopped ringing, he was possible. Because either he went in there, he didn't, the ritual with fire and purification before they enter in. If his heart was not clean before the Lord, he had to stay outside. He couldn't go in. And then obviously they had a rope tied to that, so no one could enter there, only the priest, Aaron. So they literally had to pull him out of his rope if he passed on. There was silence of the bells and signified some mishap had befallen the priest who ministered within the Holy of Holies. When the high priest wore the turban on his head with the words, "Holy to the Lord," he represented Israel before the divine presence. And the offerings he made were on behalf of the people. The consecration of the priest. The sacrifices which were prepared for the dedication service were 1 young bullock, 2 unblemished rams, and 3 kinds of birds. The offering of the bullock was the offering of the sin for the priest. You see the whole procedure before he enters in. And none of it was to be eaten. When the sin offering was for others and not for themselves, the priests were allowed to eat what was not burned upon the altar. If you go and read up on the different types of offerings, you will see there was only certain parts that they may get to offer onto the fire, and certain parts that were taken out and burnt completely. A ram was burned upon the altar to signify the complete consecration of the priest. So not only did he bring a sin offering, he had to consecrate himself. The consumption of the offering by fire and this rising of the smoke towards heaven symbolizes the receiving of the offering by the Lord. The offering of a second ram involved the cultic meal. The blood was placed on the right ear, on the right thumb, on the thumb of the right hand, and on the big toe. And that too had very meaning, big toe of the right foot of Aaron and his sons. The ears were to be consecrated to listen to the voice of the Lord. The hands to do his holy service, and the feet to carry the priest in a holy walk. It's no different for us. Because it says in Romans, how will they know? They only know by hearing. Faith cometh by hearing. The sin offering signified cleansing from sin. The whole burnt offering signified the complete devotion of the life to Yahweh. And the installation offering in the form of a peace offering involved a cultic meal. All these offerings were used in the dedication of Aaron and his sons to the priesthood. The ceremony of the third offering involved taking the breast of the lamb and waving it towards the altar and back towards Aaron, signifying that the Lord had consecrated the offering. Now here, for the first time, we'll see now that part of the offerings is also to provide for food for the priests, or for both the priests and the Levites. The thigh as well as the breast of the ram, offered for the sons, was given to the priests. Was given to the priests. The flesh of the ram and the bread were eaten at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and any leftover was burned. Same rule you'll see with the quails and stuff. Everything is left over. It's out. It's immediate.
But yes, burned out.
The ceremony was repeated on each of 7 consecutive days. Sacrifices were offered twice daily, a lamb with flour, wine and oil each morning, and a second lamb with a cereal offering in the evening. And then you have the incense and the burning of the spices. If you're going to read it, you'll see that it was a specific set of spices that you burn. There's the cayenne water, there's the cassia from the Far East, there's the cinnamon, and they would be proportionate to one another. There was a special mix, and this mix was never to be duplicated. It was only supposed to be mixed with that. In other words, it seems to have been a secret in the priesthood. This is how you're going to do it, and this is how you're going to keep it to yourselves. Each adult was to pay a half a shekel annual temple tax for the maintenance of worship. And the tax was exacted from everyone from the age of 20 years and older. The labor was for the priest to wash their hands, and the anointing oil was used for consecrations, healing, and atonement. The oil was to be used only by the priest. And here already you can see that there are certain things that only the priest will do. The Levites would be separate, they would have their own task. Then there's various regulations that follow in chapters 30 to 31. The incense was holy, and the elements of which it was composed were not to be mixed in the same proportions when used outside of the tabernacle. So observance of the 7th day as the Lord's day was to be kept. It was a sign between the Lord and his people, and served as a reminder that that God had set them apart. The Egyptians here, because there's some contentious, or at least contention with regards to certain scholars who says that seemed to have been written in. With this worshipping of the calf, Moses was still on the mountain before God. And God obviously is angry at them and threatens to destroy them. But Moses entreated the Lord on the basis of what the Egyptians might say. I love the way he speaks to the Lord, and he reminds him of his promises concerning his people. But remember, this is also a man walking a life worthy before the Lord, that's making these petitions. It's not just any man sitting there doing this. I'd say of the covenant and of his promises to the patriarchs. When Moses joined Joshua, he heard the sound of the festival but ignored it. Then he discovered what was going on, and he destroys the tablets of the commandments. This action symbolizes the ending of the covenant. The people had failed to keep their part of the covenant. Remember, he had told them what God wanted from them, and then they had agreed to it. So already there was a covenant in place. This was actually just putting it down now in the writing. He burned the calf, and the powder was cast upon the water, and they were made to drink it. And this made the people aware of the cost of their sin. But the tragic thing here after is not tragic, it separates sometimes the sheep from the goats. In that those who did not bow down to the calf, he called them out and said to him, here's the instruction. You will now go out and go against your brother, go against your family, and you will destroy them. And they went out and did exactly that. They turned on their own families. And I was thinking of the passage in the New Testament too, where Jesus says, the one guy says, when you will bury my, he says, he says, families will turn against each other because for my sake. He says, take the cross and follow me. He says, it's not going to be easy. I might ask you to do something that's not easy, it's going to cost you. He is already showing that and testing them in that way. Those that did not offend, Moses commands to slay the offenders. The Levites, those of Moses' own tribe, joined him and carried out his command to slay the guilty. The order was simple: slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. So even those that you would have loved, and said that you would love, you had to slay them. 3,000 is slain that day. Moses was to slay the infring leaders of the rebellion. Here Moses also with his action proclaims his own readiness to die on behalf of his people. This is a leader on another level. His offer was rejected since the guilty must die for their sins. And the people were instructed to depart from Horeb, and they were promised that an angel would go before them. Here the Lord for a moment withdraws intimate fellowship with them, lest the presence destroys them because of their sin. Upon hearing the news, obviously the people respond, and they are saddened by this news, because they know they can't go after the Lord. Like Moses discovered in chapter 33, when he said, I will not go without you going. I cannot go, because we are going to be destroyed if you are not with us. Moses had to pitch the tent of the meeting a good distance from the camp. Again, it says there's not intimate fellowship. If he has to put the tent on the outside of the camp, there's not intimate fellowship. There's intimate fellowship here at the moment with him, and then also Joshua, his servant. This action was in harmony with the statement that Yahweh had withdrawn his presence from the camp. Moses continued to approach the presence of God, symbolized by the clouds descending to the entrance of the tent. The people gazed upon the phenomenon from afar, stood at breathless, quite in awe and in fear. The tent of meeting outside the camp depicted the Lord's displeasure with his people. Yet he continued with them in their journey, but his presence was outside the camp, separate from them. God, however, promises Moses that his presence would go with him, but would not be in the midst of his people. The intimate relationship between the Lord and Moses is indicated by the statement, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. Remember that same passage says, he spoke face to face with Moses. Moses made a further request to see God's glory, and God agrees to permit his goodness to pass before Moses. Remember, we cannot see God, but God for a moment allows him just to see his back. And another word for his back is called the goodness of God. Just passing by. And it was so bright that it left him shining. So that when he came down from the mountain, they saw that goodness, they saw the glory of God. God presented his own sovereign rights by withholding the viewing of his face. God's presence continued veiled, and Moses heard the Lord proclaim his own name. And he was permitted to behold the back or goodness of God. The Lord further instructs Moses to prepare 2 stone tablets like the former ones, and then to ascend Mount Sinai. Very important, God's name characterized his merciful quality. It's I always laugh when I see the Muslim, the stickers that the Muslims have on their cars and stuff like that, because that's the interpretation of one of their lines, the merciful. The nature of God to be merciful towards those who sin. You see, Yahweh is the same after man has sinned as he was before man has sinned. And I thought of Peter actually. Remember Peter? Denied him 3 times. And yet, Jesus was waiting for him afterwards to deal with him and to say to him, listen guy, I love you, there's still a chance here with me. I know you fail, but you can get up again. He's gracious and helpful to the afflicted. He's full of affectionate sympathy for suffering humanity. And he doesn't hasten to punish the sinner, but allows him opportunity to change his evil course. He is plenteous in mercy, granting his blessing to the younger desert of man. He keeps his mercy to the 1000th generation, it says, and forgives iniquity. However, remember that he will not allow the guilty to go unpunished. If you are sinning and you are deliberately and continuing in sin, then you must expect God to show his justice as well. Is the love, is the justice of God, or the mercy and the justice of God. I think sometimes we confuse the two as if they are mutually exclusive. They are not. They are in fact one and the same thing. The one, this is what they do. When they talk about the, I don't know exactly how they pronounce it, or the chesed or hesed, it speaks to both those qualities. Both his goodness and kindness, his steadfast love, his faithfulness, but also to the just side of God. His goodness does not destroy his justice. Moses responds to God's revelation of himself with prayer and worship. Since God revealed himself as merciful, Moses begs him to forgive the iniquity of his people and to be in their midst. And it already speaks of, here already, if you look at this, you can already see the greatness of Moses, how God raises him. The 10 commandments are restated, even that the people had broken the covenant, it was restated and renewed. And this is the appeal to Israel to keep the covenant. And this was based on what God would do instead of what he had done. He promises to drive out the inhabitants of Canaan and to give the land to the Israelites. They were instructed not to make a covenant with the Canaanites of the land, lest they be tempted to commit idolatry, to go back to the ways that they had in Egypt. The restatement has served the purpose of giving emphasis to areas of temptation and weakness. And at the end of the 40-day theophany of God on Mount Sinai, Moses was instructed to write the word of the covenant, the 10 commandments, on the tablets. In this further revelation still, Moses descends from Mount Sinai with his face reflecting the glory of God. The people were so afraid of him, so he placed a veil over his face. When he went in before the Lord, he removed it. Moses taught all of Israel that which the Lord had made known to him. We get to the construction of the tabernacle. Let's just see where we go now. Notice in Exodus 40, 1:33, the tabernacle was erected on the first day of the month, 1 year after the Exodus. The cloud and the glory of God filled the dwelling. You will see this constantly, even the visions of Isaiah, and strength filled the temple. Leviticus, the book of priestly laws. Leviticus describes the contents as priests' laws and law of the offerings. The book is a collection of enactments constituting the legal basis for the organized, civil, and religious life of Israel. Remember, we said that these two were not separate, they were actually one. It was largely ritual. Let's go to the law of sacrifices. Leviticus was written to teach God's chosen people how to approach Him in a holy manner. The Israel was not approaching God. What it was only a year young. Instructions are given concerning burnt offerings, which had the purpose of the offering was either atonement or covering of sin. Chapter 2 gives instruction concerning the meal offering. Leaven and honey were prohibited to prevent fermentation. Remember the Passover? Chapter 3 gives instruction concerning peace offerings, slain offerings, and this was much like the burnt offerings. The purpose was to connote closeness and fellowship with God. So the entry in presenting the sacrifice was really to respect the intimacy between God and His people. He was allowing them to come in. It was a shared meal, shared by God and man to promote unity and communion. Chapters 4 to 5:13 describe the sin offerings. No sacrifice could atone for sin committed knowingly or deliberately. Remember, there was always punishment that comes with sin. The repercussions of sin is not something we can push away. We are forgiven, but the repercussions. Remember, for certain types of sin, there is death. So even for the offerings itself, there's no way out.
No escape.
There's no escape. The sin offering was the means by which the sin of man was taken away. The blood symbolized the life which was given for sin. The sin offering is for sin committed unknowingly. Chapters 5, 4, and to 6, 7 set for the guilt offering. This offering has to do with damage that had been done. Compensation payments were required, and in most cases 1/5 was added to the assessment. And remember when we talked about the bull grazing the other man's yard, there would be compensation. If you looked after the bull and you lost it, compensation, this was deliberate. If it was not deliberate, you could still go to the priest and get away with possibly an affidavit. Chapter 6, verse 8 to 7:38 gives instructions for the priest. The priests were supported by the sacrificial system, as we spoke earlier. Remember, certain offerings they were allowed to partake and eat of the offering, and certain parts of the meat would be theirs. Obviously, they would stock it from somewhere. The fire of the altar was never to go out. It was sacred since it was kindled on the altar by God Himself. The burnt offering was to be burned continually upon the altar as a token of Israel's consecration to God. The cereal offering was to be offered by the anointed priest perpetually, morning and evening. No part of it could be eaten since it was offered for the priests. With the sin offering, all the flesh except the fat became the priest's portion. And this is how God looked after them. Remember what I said to you? God says to them, I am your reward. Meaning, I will take care of you. I call you, so I'm going to take care of you. The peace offering was the only one of the sacrifices of which the offerer was permitted to partake. The Lord's portion was the fat and was to be burned on the altar. If you're going to read the different offerings, it's mostly the fat parts like then around there's lots of fat. If you've seen a sheep that's being split, there's lots of fat sitting at the bottom. Yeah, The same with the bulls, it's that fat part there that really moves. Once the stomach was taken out, that's the part that was normally burnt up. The rest of the flesh belonged to the offerer. He was to present cakes of different kinds of offering. The Israelites were reminded the Lord had provided for the support of the priest through the sacrificial system. Then we get to the consecration of the priest. Instruction of the materials in Exodus 28-29. The blood of the sin offering was to cleanse and sanctify the altar at which the priests were to minister. The installation of the priest was followed by a sacrilege of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's two older sons. They took fire from the altar when they had no right to it, and their sin brought about their death. Remember, they will possibly even take over from their father, and then eventually it's given over to Eleazar and to Ithamar. Aaron and his two younger sons were prohibited from mourning for them. What they brought was what they called unauthorized fire or uncensed fire to the Lord. Remember, Aaron is said to go in and take in and fulfill a specific role. No one may overstep that line. Same with the Levites, they were never to overstep any of these lines. God decided on a specific person, a specific privilege and responsibility for this given person. The same with Moses' leadership. You will see when people are questioning his leadership, God sorts them out because God decided this is the name. A prohibition against the priests using alcohol when they entered the tent of meeting was given. They were to perform duties with clear minds, unclouded with alcohol. When Moses had reminded Aaron cannot find their instruction to eat the sin offering for the people, Aaron replied that the judgment imposed upon two of his sons indicated that he and the other sons were not sufficiently free of sin to eat the portion of the sin offering. I think that whole incident where he questioned him, the story reads as follows, in that it seems that he had unknowingly, there was mistakes being made, but it wasn't deliberate. And so all he was reminding him is that I do make mistakes from time to time. It is not deliberate. And you are calling it deliberate and therefore saying, I have sinned. So he was literally questioning his heart, and Aaron saying to him, you have no right to do that. The laws of purity. Exodus 11:1-15:33 deals with ritual cleanness. Animals were unclean because they had been sacred to other gods, either repulsive in looks or habits. Let me just change that. Either repulsive in looks or habits. Remember, they had to be unblemished. No marks on them and can't be lame. They need to be spotless. Blood, issues of blood and running sores were unclean because of their unpleasantness and because they were also contagious. Alright, because remember there's life in the blood, and the blood stream is normally which carries disease also, so that can be carried over to another person. Unclean fish were those with neither fins nor scales, either unclean or clean, because the problem was they made a distinction between the Gentiles and themselves, and that they had to come back to the Jewish rites actually now. Even though Jesus had died, taken their sin upon himself, they had to come back and do the whole Jewish ritual system thing. They were supposed to be circumcised, all this, and God says, whoa, let me just explain to you how things work here. Birds of prey and carrion were prohibited. Some locusts were permissible and other insects were prohibited. And you do realize that locusts and certain insects has actually got a protein in them, so you can eat them. Only animals which divided the hoof and chewed the cud were to be eaten. Physical contact with dead animals was also to be avoided. This was given because of the holiness of God. God always called us to separate. So a lot of these laws and rituals or merely reminders of what God expected them in their worship, in the way they came. It was a reflection of what was in their hearts, more than really the physical reality of things. But they didn't interpret it that way, unfortunately. In chapter 12, a woman who bore a child, a male child, was unclean for 40 days, and for a female birth, 80 days. At the end of 40 days, she was to bring a lamb for a burnt offering and a fowl for a sin offering. Chapters 13 and 14 said for the uncleanness due to leprosy, these people were banished from the city till they recovered. Then he needs to undergo a cleansing ritual. He comes before the priest checks him out, the priest says he's been going away for 7 days, he comes back and they check the marks again. And then there's different ways how they describe it. Because sometimes they have these red spots or this white on their bodies, and if it doesn't change, he will send it back out. It's the same like in the houses that they have the rot in the walls and stuff like that. When they came in, they would clean it. If they came back after a specific time and it developed again, they would have to tear the wall or that house down and rebuild it again. Chapter 8, which is in chapter 14, is concerned with fungus growth in houses. These stones had to be removed if fungus growth continued, houses to be destroyed. Chapter 15 is concerned with discharges from the sexual organs. Abnormal discharges required 7-day quarantine, bathing, and washing the rituals. And some of these rules that we're reading now also determines who stays in the camp and doesn't stay in the camp. And we'll do that later. We have the Day of Atonement, as I said earlier. It's only one day in the year when fasting, which was an outward expression of sorrow and repentance, was required. This atonement was made for all the sins of the congregation. We move to the Holiness Code, which is Leviticus is seen as the law of holiness because of the emphasis placed on God's holiness and on the necessity that His people also be holy. Remember that verses in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. We are called to be separate. Chapter 17 concerns the slaughtering of animal for food. Chapter 18 concerns immoral behavior. The Israelites were not to follow the practices of the Egyptians and Canaanites. They were not to have sexual intercourse with blood relatives. Neither were they to take two sisters as wives. The Israelites were prohibited from sacrificing their offspring to Moloch. So if you go back to the incident with Abraham, that was practiced quite some time ago already in the surrounding nations. Chapter 19 gives instructions concerning the social order. Children were to respect their parents, and idolatry was to be avoided. They had to look after the poor. They had to take a certain portion of their own income and make sure that the poor was looked after. And in chapter 20, you have penalties for crimes listed in chapter 18. Chapter 21, special instructions for the priest are given. Mourning for and touching the dead disqualified the priest for their duties. So it was their own family, even then, would deny these activities except in the case of immediate family. So a close friend they couldn't even touch. The high priest was not to exhibit grief or defiance of any dead body. He was not to leave the sanctuary in order to do honor to the dead. He was restricted in marriage to a virgin of his own people. And the same like the animals who didn't qualify even to be a sin offering. Here men were not qualified for priestly duties that any kind of imperfection or blemish. Chapter 22 was that the priest was not to touch the sacrifices if he was ritually unclean. And then there's other laws that follow. Chapter 23 sets forth the holy days. You have the feast of the unleavened bread. You have the Sabbath. Then you have the Day of Atonement. And each has a different meaning. Unleavened bread for the continuation of remembrance of God's deliverance from Egypt. The Sabbath is a day of rest and worship, and like God rested, and so the body needs rest. Day of Atonement signified was a month for the sorrow for sins and gratitude to God. And this too is part of our worship if you think about it. A lot of these things we still do today. It's still part of not necessarily the ritual, but when we come before God, part of worship will include some of these issues. Because when we do go before, there could be gratitude, there could be thanksgiving, there could be praise, there could be petition, there could be the request for forgiveness. The Feast of Tabernacles was for the end of the harvest and remembrance of long sojourn in the wilderness. Then you have the Passover, which was the remembrance of God's deliverance. The Feast of Trumpets, for the consecration of harvest to God. Chapter 24 is concerned with the use of holy objects. The latter part of this chapter deals with blasphemy, and this was punished by stoning to death. The blasphemy is an odd thing because in the New Testament you get the part where Jesus says, you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, that cannot be forgiven. And they say it's the worst sin that you can commit. And I think sometimes we just need to bring it in context. Because remember, Father, Son, Spirit. Spirit too is God. God is Spirit. So, is the blasphemy against the Spirit worse than rejecting God? You reason it out like that, then do you understand that he was literally saying, if you reject God, because he knew their hearts, so what he was saying to them, I actually see your hearts, and I know that you've already rejected God. Therefore, your end is hell. That is what he was trying to tell them. Also, a summary of the penalty of other laws is given in the last part of the chapter. Chapter 25 discusses the special years. Remember, you had the 7th year, and then you had the 50th year, which was the year of Jubilee. 7 years for the slaves. They were free after the 7th year, every 7th year. Then also the land had to rest every 7th year, even the land had to get a Sabbath rest. The 7th year required that every 7th year the land would lie fallow. Every 50th year was a Jubilee year. This was freedom from tilling the land in general, freedom throughout the country. Chapter 26 tells of the blessings for obedience and the punishment for the disobedience. So literally in the 50th year, during the 49th year and the 50th year, the land would have rest. In those 2 years, it would be 2 years of rest, literally. The people were promised rain and abundant harvest if they obeyed. Chapter 27 deals with the making of studies in the Pentateuch, lesson 11, and now we're going from Sinai to the plains of Moab. In Numbers now, 1 verse 1 to 21 to 35. So I will obviously cover the last part of it. And here's just to understand the purpose and meaning of Israel's wilderness experiences. With the exception of Exodus 32 to 34, there is very little narrative material was included after the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19. The latter part of Exodus and all of Leviticus deal with the ritual and legal codes. Numbers return to a narration of the experiences of Israel on the journey. Remember the previous book? It was mostly concerning regulations and laws and so forth. Here we're going back to the narrative, we're going back to stories of their journeys towards Canaan. The first 10 chapters describe preparations for departing from Sinai, and then the next 11 deals with Israel's experiences until she reaches the plain of Moab. And then before they leave, there's the first census, because obviously they need to be counted. So God instructs Moses to take a census of men 20 years of age and older, and they end up with a figure of 603,550 people. That's excluding women and children. And it seems that if you add all of them, you would be sitting in excess of 2 million. Now some scholars have a problem with it because they said, even if you just leave a meter in between somebody and then 50 across, you would have the amount of people that was there, it would be 20 kilometers long. That's a huge mass of people. Now the problem they had was, how would they be sustained? How would they be maintained in such a place? With food and all of those things. Remember, they left off quite a bit. they left with quite some riches also, which meant they could be able to trade, buy, and so forth. So that's not practice that you can exclude from the argument and just say that it wouldn't be able to maintain them. Remember, they also had God at their side. God called them out. In the same way, God calls Moses to be in the. He says, if I'm your reward, I'm going to take care of you because I called you. So he calls out his people and says, if I called you, I'm going to take care of you. If you need to start trusting me and obeying me. The Levites also were not counted if you exclude the children and the women. Because they were excluded from military service and they were only to transport and protect the tabernacle. Now, as they traveled, you had the tribes of Leah and you had the tribes of Rachel, and then you had the concubine tribes. Eventually, before they had children, they were the concubines, and those sons born to them. And so they were set up in this order when they left home. So let's just take a look then at the positions of the tribes. With the tent meeting now a very central figure in the cultic organization or ritual and worship of the Israelite nation, also their organization. The symbol of God's presence amongst Israel, it represented again. However, when you see what happens now, remember that with Moses and with them moving, God was angry when the tent was staying on the outside. Now when they leave, when they depart, God says, no, let's divide the 12 tribes into 3 groups. And then you have a leader of each group. One which was Judah, who had 3 nations with him, 3 tribes with him. Reuben had 3, Ephraim had 3, and Dan had 3. And then they would follow in that order, and each would have their own banner. Judah had a banner with a lion on, Reuben, human head, Ephraim, one with an ox, and Dan with an eagle. And those very same faces you will find in the book of Ezekiel. You will also, if you look very closely in the Gospels, you will see those very same things. You will see those same banners coming through with Jesus. There's no time to sit with that now and explain it to you. They moved and came to rest in the above order, obviously, with the Levites in the center. So you had 2 tribes, Levites, 2 groups. Then you had Levites, and you had now 2 groups following. And the principle is simply to say that they had found the unity and organization by focusing on the presence of God in their midst. Is the center. You heard the song, Jesus be the center of my life. The Levites can be traced through Eleazar and Ithamar, as I said to you earlier, because Abihu and Naboth, sons of Aaron, offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. It was considered unauthorized because they were unqualified. Aaron was supposed to represent specific rituals. Even the priests that were under him couldn't perform certain things. The Aaronic or priesthood, those would be called the sacrificing priests. Then you had the Levites, and here you have the distinction between the 2 groups who were their servants. They were qualified to work in the sacred precincts, obviously, of the courtyard and the tabernacle. And very important here, we have the firstborn that is substituted or replaced by the Levites for service. Remember, when they left, all the firstborn were consecrated to him. Here he says to them, the Levites are now going to fulfill their role. They will stand in your place. You will now consecrate them to me now. They are mine. I'm going to use them in service to help you and teach you how to worship. Their ministry proclaimed all that belonged to the Lord because he had delivered them. And therefore the installation of the Levites was a ceremony of redemption. They were redeemed by God himself. Then you have the Levite Cleanse, which consisted of Kohath. They carried the holiest of the tabernacle and the courtyard. So they would carry stuff like the altar. But a lot of this stuff was actually wrapped already. So the priest himself would wrap most of the holiest parts. It would be covered in skins and some of the curtain material, and then they would actually hand it over to the Kohathites. They wouldn't go and wrap it themselves, they wouldn't touch it, they were not allowed to touch it at all. So you have the Kohath, then you have Gershon and Merari. The active service started at the age of 30 up until 60. However, in the later passage in chapter 8, they then tell you again from 25 to 50. So there's a slight discrepancy there. They were as carefully organized for the service of Yahweh, similar to militia for battle. Aaron then sons dismantled and packed the sacred of the sanctuary, since the Kohathites were not allowed to see or touch them. They weren't even allowed to see it, so by the way. Then you have the first priestly scroll. And it was actually came about this very funny way, but we'll get to that. Now you have the various laws and regulations. And then you have the unclean persons, which was either lepers, those with unnatural discharges, as we said earlier in some of the rules and regulations. Those who had touched dead bodies. These three groups were excluded from the camp because of the presence of Yahweh. Suspected unfaithful wives. Note, suspected unfaithful wives. There's no evidence as yet. The husband is allowed to take them before the priest, and then before the priest, they ordered to do a ceremony, and he would ask them, listen, are you guilty or not? And if they were guilty, they were given a form of punishment or a curse. And this was written on a piece of paper or a scroll. It was then thrown into water into a jar of some sorts, and they had to drink this curse. What would happen is they would literally be barren thereafter.
Sure.
There's no children that's going to be born again thereafter. In chapter 6 you have the Nazarite vow, and the Nazarite vow simply means set apart for some special for Yahweh. In the case of Samson, and then you also see it in the case of Samuel. And the three things that was key here for the Nazarite vow: he had to abstain from any fermented wine. His head was to be unshorn. If there was any sin or that happened during this vow, what would happen is he had to shave his head for 7 days, and then they come back again, make restitution, and then he can get his hair grow again. But it didn't mean that it fell away completely, unless it was deliberate sin, because there was no offering for that. And then last, you had to have no contact with a corpse. And in the case of Samson, you can see him break some of those rules. Remember the lion?
Yeah.
But I'm also sure his mother really told him, because if you read the passages, it doesn't look like his mother taught him concerning the Nazarite vow. That's possibly why he might have also known it. But if you look at his character and his nature, then it's so opposite to, except for the hair and not taking unfermented wine, then it seems almost sometimes the opposite of what the Nazarite would look like or would be busy doing. Chapter 7. There's the repetition of the offerings of the 12 leaders of Israel, and then in chapter 8 describes the making and the lighting of the lamps of the holy place, and the purification and the presentation of the Levites to Yahweh. And here we also find three events which are significant as background to the New Testament. There's the purification ceremony, in which they call the waters of expiation. Now if you go to the New Testament, this could be a forerunner to baptism. You also have the Christian ordination, when they have to lay hands on the Levites who are set apart for duty to the Lord, or called to serve. And then once they are consecrated, remember, they become substitutes for the nation. And there too, it's always, it gives us a glimpse of what is to come, in that Christ would be the substitution for us, for his people, for those who would come to know him, for those who would hear his voice and respond to it. So there's those three things which it speaks to. So that in these things sometimes it's not necessarily expressed as prophecy, but it's almost prophetic in a sense. It also acts as a substitute for the nation. Substitution, I double that. Chapter 9 describes the second Passover for those who did not observe the first because of ritual uncleanness. Remember, there's obviously the laws. We see the laws later. It's almost as if it's not in the text itself, but it's almost as if certain people would have been excluded. So now they come and they say, listen, for those who were excluded because of certain things and couldn't perform it, we need you to come and observe the Passover as it is the first time. But the writer says, and he makes it very pertinent, the second opportunity was not to encourage neglect. It's sometimes in the way we deal with God, in the way we understand and see Him. So that, remember, He doesn't give you a second chance, or a third chance, or a fourth chance to say to you, it's okay, you can continue your ways, I'll just forgive you. In words, yes, it says clearly in James, if you confess your sins, He is faithful and right and just to forgive your sins. But that does not mean that you can consistently and deliberately continue in sin, even if you've made it right with God. You cannot do it. You're setting yourself up for failure. I'm not prescribing now that you can lose your salvation. That's a subject for another day. But we cannot deliberately continue in sin. We are now people of the Spirit. We're no longer under the law, but we're people of the Spirit. And so all the writer is trying to say is that the neglect of your faith is not acceptable. Or putting it another way, neglect of your heart is not acceptable, because this is what we're supposed to go before the Lord afterwards. Chapter 10 describes the making and use of the silver trumpets, which was used by Moses to communicate with the people and the leaders. Remember the long shout and the short blast? So either to call them up or to leave, either to rest or to leave. And then, very important, only the priests blew the trumpets. And that was simply to say that Yahweh had control over the camp, because it was His called people, those called out of the Israelite nation to serve Him in the Tabernacle. They were given the right to blow the trumpets only. Again, there's this constant distinction of how God wants to deal with us, or how He expects us to deal with Him, and how we are supposed to treat what is given to us, life, as sacred. Then from Sinai to Paran, Israel stays at Sinai for 1 year, except for 10 days short of it. And then they start moving into the wilderness of Paran. It's mainly the peninsula of South Peninsula of Sinai. Also the traditional home of Ishmael. Here, again, as they moved around, you had the standard of Judah. But here there's a slight difference. Then you had the Levites. Not the two groups and then 2 groups. Yes, it's the group of Judah. Then you have the Levites, then you have Reuben, Ephraim, and Dan following. In chapter 11, 1 to 12 to 16, describes the problems encountered between Sinai and Kadesh. And the interesting thing in this part here is they mention the word rebel. Now, the word rebel could mean the mixed multitude that went up also with them, that was encouraging the people to say, listen guys, the wrong decision was taken here, and you need to speak to your leader Moses. You need to say to him, this is wrong, we need to go back, there's no food here, at least we had food, yes we were enslaved, but at least we had food there. And then the people respond and show their gratitude to God for his past mercies. But God doesn't take the ingratitude very lightly, and the fire of the Lord breaks out, and Moses has to intervene. Moses could not bear the complaining of the people, and God told him to bring 70 elders to receive his spirit also, and be Moses' helpers at this time. You can see how the organization of the nation, it starts building, it starts expanding. Very important. The writer wants us to know that Moses acted under the power of God, and his way of acting was very distinct from those who would eventually try and either usurp his position or try and be equal to him. And we'll see in the later passages how God deals with them, and how Moses is almost made distinct and put on a pedestal by God and said, listen, this is my man. This is the guy. At this early stage, the Spirit of the Lord was related to prophecy. Now, prophecy was a divine manifestation of the divine presence and power of God. And what happened is when God brought in these 70 helpers, and he also gave them part of the Spirit that he had put on Moses. And what happened is they started prophesying. And along comes Joshua and he sees these two guys prophesying, and he's disturbed by this. He's thinking, listen, that's the man of God. That's the one who receives the revelation. That's the one who brings the prophetic word. Who are these guys? And he's concerned that they could be possibly rivals now to Moses within the group, or claim to be on equal footing with him in terms of his status or position as God's head for the Israelites at that time, as priest and judge. However, Moses is very careful to remind Joshua, listen, guy, let me explain to you. The power of God cannot be limited by time, place, or performance. Moses understood all of these matters, and even though he received the law, he understood its meaning, he grasped its full meaning. Because in the Old Testament, you have time and space at Jerusalem, at Shiloh, at Shechem. In the New Testament, this is the living temple walking around. This is the sanctuary of God. Then along the way, we have the issue of the quails. God is angry with their gluttony. Also, then sends out the plague to deal with them for their gluttony. Because they were supposed to collect enough for the family, or for the harvest the praise and Lord, give me daily bread. The psalmist also, in certain psalms, you will clearly utter the words, don't give me too much and don't give me too little. Just give me enough, says the one psalmist. For the day, that's all I need. In fact, in the one psalm it reads, don't give me too much, I might become full of pride.
Yeah.
That's a reading of my own words. Chapter 12 illustrates the supremacy and uniqueness of Moses. He is greater than any prophet. Why? And listen to this, because he spoke face to face with God. And whereas other prophets receive visions or dreams, Moses speaks face to face with God. That is how they describe his relationship with him. And this causes jealous ambition by Miriam and Aaron, because they too obviously prophesied in a sense already, because they were part of the leadership. And the first issue that they raise with him is that he's married to a Cushite woman. Remember, he married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro. Jethro, also called But that was not actually the real issue. The real issue was that they were starting to make a comparison between themselves and Moses. And that's where the jealousy set in. They were saying, listen here, this is what he did, but we've done this also. God has spoken to him, God has spoken to us also. God has revealed to him, God has revealed to us also. So why this distinction? Why is he given more status than us? That was the actual question. That is what they were complaining about. So they wanted to put themselves on the same footing as he. You can only have one leader, you can't have 3, 4, 5 leaders. You can only have one leader. In this case, Moses was their chosen leader. And God shows himself again, dissatisfied with their revolt. And Miriam is left leprous. Aaron immediately recognizes his own sin and then he confesses his sin before the Lord. And he petitions Moses on behalf of Miriam, listen, you need to pray for her. And Miriam is healed. The events in the wilderness of Paran, chapter 13, you have the 12 spies being sent out. The 2 spies that is key here is Joshua, son of Nun, and then Caleb, son of Jephunneh. They are the only 2 that bring back favorable reports, even though most of them had brought back fruit of the land. The other 10 describe the land as people far bigger than themselves. In fact, they said they look like locusts as opposed to these guys. These guys were giants. The land was occupied by Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites, and Amalekites. The Hittites were famous for their armies and for their fighting. So it must have been a very scary thing for them to land up in a place. But God had prepared them all along the way and gotten them ready actually for this day. But even though God had readied them for war, they were still discouraged by the 10 rather than the 2 who said, listen here, this is what we see, we can take it. Chapter 14 presents the discouragement and rebellion of the people. Caleb and Joshua begging for them to have faith in Yahweh. We also have the intercession of Moses and Aaron and the repentance of the people. And again, the greatness of Moses is underscored by the fact that Yahweh granted Moses' petition for Israel. But that's the thing with sin. Along with sin, deliberate sin, comes punishment. Those 20 years and older for the rebellion would be death in the desert during the 40 years of wandering. Only Joshua and Caleb would be spared. Then chapter 15 contains a collection of material on ritual observances again, which we don't go through. Chapter 16 you have revolt again. You have the Reubenites, Dathan and Abiram, disputing the civil leadership with Moses. And they disputed on the following grounds: that they were descendants of the eldest sons of Jacob, and therefore right to equal leadership. They also disputed on the ground that they were better off in Egypt. In other words, they were questioning his leadership. Why did you take us out? So they weren't saying God called us out. They were now saying you called us out. So they weren't acknowledging God at all in this matter. They accused Moses of having made himself a prince over them. They didn't treat him as one called by God to lead them out. They also accused Moses of not completing the mission of leading the people into Canaan. Remember, he had taken them there, and they had forgotten about all that they had done in between, about all the rebellion in between towards God. They had forgotten all of that. And now they were simply only looking at a man, and they reject him. And by implication, they reject God. Moses' appointment by God is unraveled, and the earth swallows up the rebels and their families. Remember the story? With their tents and all, the ground just opened up. A second revolt is led by Korah and 250 leaders, contesting the authority and cultic specialization of Moses and Aaron. And they want to offer incense. Remember the rules? It's the Aaronic priesthood who makes the sacrifice, brings the incense and so forth. Nobody can go in there that is not qualified. And even though they knew the rules, they said, no. nonsense, what you're giving us is not true, we should also be able to go in. And so they question not only the word of Moses, they question the word of God now. And they forget that the two sons of Aaron were killed by God because they offered unauthorized incense. They just forgot it. There was the history right in front of them, and yet they decided they would make themselves equal in this regard, and they would disobey God. The 250 men of Korah assumed the right to offer incense to God who consumed. It was an Aaronic privilege. Chapter 17 reinforces the selection of the Aaronic priesthood and the position of the Levites. God asked that a rod from each tribe be brought to the tent of meeting before the ark. And then the rod belonging to the tribe chosen of God sprouted and produced blossoms and almonds. And I think that is so significant that it also produces the fruit. Because God is the God of creation. The 18th, the Levites who assisted the priests were to be supported by the tithe of the people of Israel. And you remember, they were not supposed to be owning any property. However, the Levites were supposed to take that tithe given by the people and then take a tenth of it, or a tithe of it, and give back to the priest again. Chapter 19 describes the purification of those who touch the dead. In chapter 20 you have the death of Miriam. Right at the beginning of chapter they note the death. You have the sin of Moses at Meribah. Remember, he was the people had cried out for water again. And God told him to lift up his rod, strike the rock, and the water would flow from it. Remember I explained to you how there would be water in these channels in the desert. And if you knocked it, the water would flow out. And instead, what Moses did was, he did not give God any glory. It's one thing you never do. You never steal the glory of God. You don't take anything from it. I think it's Psalm 115, the first verse, which says, "Not to us, O Lord, not to us, give glory to your name." Then you have the refusal of the Edomites to allow passage through their land, and we'll deal with that now. You have the death of Aaron also. Remember, for both Moses and Aaron, the penalty was the same because of the rock, the issue and the river. They would not see Canaan, they would not enter. For them too, they weren't excused for their sin. When the sin is deliberate, you will have to face the consequences. So even the highest man here, chosen by God, you would have to suffer the consequences of sin. Moses, you also have the death of Aaron and the transfer of his priestly robe to his son Eleazar. Moses took credit for producing water from the rock, which he struck with his rod. Both he and Aaron would never enter Canaan as punishment for their sin. You have chapter 21. Here God's plan for Israel's future required the destruction of all their enemies. It's very important to remember this. Remember I said to you in all of the passages, when God gives an order, He always has this little verse at the back which says, "And whoever did all that the Lord commanded him to do." In their case here, it was utter destruction for any nation that they came across. It was complete destruction. The action appears savage in our day and age. That type of action would appear very savage. However, the only hope for Israel's survival in the struggle against the historical powers lay in the utter destruction of their enemies. Remember, there was a certain nation that they came across, and God said to them, "Listen here, not now. Their sin is not full yet. At the right time." And it's 400 years later that they meet up with them, and God says to them, "Now destroy them. Now they must pay for their sins." So God gives them nearly 400 years. He shows mercy to them. Amazing. 400 years. Victory would come only through divine power, and the spoils of victory would be devoted to Yahweh who gave the victory. Another way of putting it, when they went in, the whole town is said to be devoted to destruction. So it's devoted to God. The destruction here is God's punishment upon that nation. the Israelite nation was merely the hand that God used to mete out the punishment. Just like in the case when the Israelites sinned against God, remember, He would bring in a foreign nation to mete out His punishment. Even though the foreign nation thought it was them, it was God is saying, I'm going to use you and move you to punish my people and to teach them a lesson. The last of Israel's stories of complaint resulted in the Lord sending fiery serpents. Their bites brought death and caused the people to remember that God's provision of manna was for life and not for death. The bronze serpent did not deliver, but the word of the Lord delivered those who were willing to express obedience by looking to the bronze. So remember the command is, look to the serpent, so it's God's words. And that's what you're following. That's what you're obeying. Around Edom and Moab to the Jordan Valley as they traveled, they then crossed the river of Arnon and entered the land of the Amorites. And here begins the conquest already. They're not in the land yet, but the conquest actually starts just outside. They get two opportunities to kind of hone their war skills. So the king of Sihon and the king of Og, and they utterly destroy them. And then you also have the story of Balak and Balaam. Remember the seer Balaam? Called, I absolutely love the part where the donkey turns around and talks to him, and it's almost as if it's normal to him to talk back to the donkey. Because the passage doesn't say he had a fright or anything like that. It was almost normal, like, please, he just talk back to the donkey. But God would withhold punishment. Not punishment. God would withhold another nation meting out punishment to his people or destruction to his people. And he too, his heart is turned because he realizes that every time he goes on his knees, that the one who's talking now is the real God, telling him this is not going to happen. 3 times. And what is key in that story also is the fact that by the 3rd time that they ask him, he is also disobedient. Because now he says, oh, let me not go with you. Where all he had to do was stay. He just had to stay. But he was part of God's plan.